My lady, the next witness, and indeed this week's final witness, is Dr. Jim McMenamin. May he be sworn, please? Oh, dear. I'm so sorry.
I don't think you're meant to give evidence.
Let's try again.
Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Dr. McMenamin, thank you for the assistance that you've given to the inquiry so far. You've provided a witness statement, and I know that you are familiar with the corporate witness statement as well from Public Health Scotland, and thank you for coming to give your evidence to the inquiry today. Please keep your voice up, speak into the microphones so that the stenographer can hear you for the transcript. If you need a break at any time, just ask. I'm going to begin by setting out your career history so far as it's relevant to the inquiry. You are a medical doctor with a Master's in Public Health and Honorary Clinical Senior Lecturer at the School of Health and Wellbeing at the University of Glasgow. You were appointed as a consultant epidemiologist to the Scottish Centre for Infection and Environmental Health in 2003. You were then interim clinical director and strategic lead for the respiratory viral team within HPS, and you are now the head of Infection Service and the Strategic Incident Director for COVID-19 at Public Health Scotland. Is that all right?
Thank you. And one extra thing, that I was the chair for the 3 years of the National Incident Management Team in Scotland.
Thank you. For the 3 years involving COVID-19?
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Well, it's your evidence prior to that we're interested in today in Module 1. And I'm going to begin, if I may, by using you to set out a history and structure of Scotland's public health bodies. As you tell us in your statement, Dr. McMenamin, Public Health Scotland works to protect and improve the health of people in Scotland and to reduce health inequalities. It became a legal entity on the 7th of December of 2019 and came into operation on the 1st of April 2020. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But that means that in relation to the time to which this module relates, the national leadership for protecting the Scottish public from infectious diseases and environmental hazards was the remit of Health Protection Scotland, or HPS, which was part of the NHS National Services Scotland. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
HPS led on preparing for high-consequence infectious diseases, epidemics and pandemics, and National Services Scotland led on preparation for general civil emergencies and whole system civil emergencies. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. You explain in your witness statement that Public Health Scotland brought together 3 legacy bodies: Health Protection Scotland, Information Services Division, and NHS Health Scotland. So taking those 3 bodies in turn, if we may. HPS can trace its history back to 1969 and the creation of the Communicable Diseases Scotland unit, which was a specialist unit tasked with conducting surveillance of communicable infections. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. And the Communicable Diseases Scotland unit then evolved, absorbing and expanding its remit to include helping protect the public from non-infectious environmental threats to health. And at one point, the unit was renamed the Scottish Centre for Infection and Environmental Health, and it then became Health Protection Scotland in 2005. That's a whistle-stop tour of the history of public health in Scotland. But Health Protection Scotland was responsible for providing health information together with the Information Services Division. And National Health Service Health Scotland was Scotland's National Health Improvement Agency. We have additional information about this in the Public Health Scotland corporate statement, my lady. explaining that the work of National Health Scotland focused on what could be done to improve public health in Scotland and to reduce what was seen as unfair and avoidable health inequalities. And is that work very much still in progress?
Certainly, very much so. It's at the centre of everything that our organisation, Public Health Scotland, has been set up to address.
Thank you. Public Health Scotland was created through the programme of public health reform that began in 2015 with the Public Health Review, and as we've already made mention, was delivered up to and including 2020 through the Public Health Reform Programme. Are you able, please, Dr McMenamin, to explain why it was concluded that Public Health Scotland ought to be created and was created when that happened?
Thank you. Over time, there had certainly been a very significant number of infection challenges and information challenges in the community. From the perspective of inequalities, earlier in proceedings, we've heard testimony from experts on just what the impact has been of those inequalities. The purposeful bringing together of the three organisations was to try and put inequalities at the centre of everything that we do to improve healthy well-being in the population. And that very purposeful attempt then was to bring together the relative strengths of each of those organisations to try and assist in that process, if you like, to have some synergy between each of those to make sure that nothing was falling between the stones.
So do you see there being a benefit of having a single unified public health agency?
Very much so.
Yeah. What about the timing of it, Dr McMenamin? Why was Public Health Scotland made operational in April of 2020, given, as we know, that was really a month or two after the COVID-19 pandemic had hit?
It's certainly unfortunate timing, but nonetheless something which had been well scheduled and was very supported by all of the territorial NHS boards and the other boards in Scotland and by Scottish Government, and also by COSLA, because this new organisation was to be one in which it was jointly sponsored by the chief officers of each of the local authorities and by Scottish Government. So this signalled approach where we were going to be coming into being became part of the legal framework in December 2019, and then we came into being on that April 2020. That was as smooth as we could make it transition, where our NSS, National Services Scotland colleagues assisted us all the way through, and as we became this new organisation, rather than the 100 or so people that we might have had at the start of this to try and deal with things, we now had access to more than 1,000 personnel to be able to help us in dealing with that.
So in terms of the timing of it, it was something that had been in the planning for several years. You mentioned COSLA, that's the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, isn't it? What was the rationale for and the effect of Public Health Scotland's accountability to both national and local government?
Well, this again was a new bit of innovative thinking where we were trying to ensure that no matter what we did, it was to enable the health of the population at a local level to be best assisted within the combined efforts of the new organisation.
All right, thank you. Some questions now about funding. You tell us in your witness statement that Public Health Scotland's opening budget and staffing levels were, in your view, not sufficient for the organisation to be able to deliver health protection in a response that was required when the pandemic hit. Does that remain your view? And explain to us, please, Dr. McMenamin, why you hold that view.
Yes. In this instance, the particular thrust that we had here was that we had to have a funding that was adequate but flexible. How do we make sure that any ring fencing that we have didn't get in the way of what we needed to do within the new organisation? Now, I understand that financial rules and regulations are essential within our National Health Service organisation to make sure that we demonstrate value for money in everything that we do. But nonetheless, it becomes important that we're able to have flexibility in how we can best utilise that funding available to us. But there's one important caveat to that, that for that funding, which was, you will see from our statement submissions, was funding in a pre-pandemic setting, was something which was felt to be adequate for a pandemic. As we move into that flexibility that we then would like to have is something which becomes much more attractive to allow a speed of response.
Yeah, thank you. May we have on screen, please, document 101052. This is a document that we can see from the bottom right-hand corner was created in December of 2006, and it's Health Protection Scotland's Health Protection Framework for the response to an influenza pandemic in Scotland. We can see from the first two paragraphs that this is indeed a document devoted to pandemic influenza rather than any other type of pandemic. Dr. McMenamin, why did this framework focus only on influenza as opposed to any other type of pandemic? And how, if you can explain to us, how did that in any way hamper the situation?
This document was produced before what has been called the swine flu pandemic of
2009. Yes.
It was, at the time, what we could see was the likeliest issue to come and challenge us. So from that perspective, it was very deliberately focused on a response to pandemic influenza in which we, on a UK basis, were working collaboratively to deal with that.
All right. Let's look, please, if we can, at page 7 of this document. And we can see that the aims of the health protection framework is to provide a tactical framework for health protection response, to put the health protection framework for the response to an influenza pandemic in Scotland in the context of the overarching national arrangements laid out in the UK Health Department's Influenza Pandemic Contingency Plan, the Health Protection Agency Pandemic Influenza Plan, and the HPS Emergency Response Plan. Just pausing there, this, of course, predated the United Kingdom influenza pandemic strategy, which we know was created in 2011. And the inquiry has heard from several sources that despite certainly best efforts at a time close to the pandemic hitting, it was never updated. Are you able to tell us whether this older document, created as it was in 2006, was ever updated to attempt to give more timely advice to Scotland on pandemic influenza?
Thank you. It was never updated, but the reason why that was never updated was that, as you've outlined, we then had a pandemic of swine influenza. There was a UK discussion about how we would best learn the lessons and adopt recommendations from the learning lessons that we collectively had. That meant that there was a deliberate attempt to have a coordinated UK approach to how we deal with things.
Right.
And although at the time that we did ask our Scottish Government colleagues about whether they would like this to be revisited, the clear indication that we had at the time was that we would be using a UK approach to deal with this.
Right. So moving ahead from 2006, swine flu hits in 2009. The UK government commissioned the Hine Review, which indeed led to the strategy being created in 2011. Once that was in place, did the UK strategy replace this older document, or did they sit alongside each other?
That's right, that it replaced things because we were then working to a UK approach that was coordinated.
Thank you. Can we take that down, please, and replace it with document 147859, which is an interim report from the Health Protection Stocktake Working Group. And we see that the date of that is July of 2011. Do you know, as a matter of fact, whether or not this came into force before or after the UK strategy?
I'm not quite sure because of the relative dates of when things were produced. I can't recall whether whether the reports were synchronous or not.
This was a working group established to examine the arrangements put in place in 2005, which I think had led to the 2006 strategy that we've just looked at, and to ensure that they were still fit for purpose. Is that right?
Yes.
And this interim report contains a series of recommendations. Could we go to page 46, please? Thank you. We can move through this quite quickly, but the recommendations relate firstly to capacity and resilience. If we can scroll down, please. Roles and responsibilities. Priorities and outcomes. Governance and consistency. Thank you. This was an interim report. The final report, which we can put up, please, at 147828. Thank you. And can we go to page 44, please? And we thank you very much. Sets out, in fact, if we can we go up to the previous page so that we can see what the columns. There we are. On the left-hand side, I think we have the recommendations set out, and then the next column along, going from left to right, we can see whether the recommendation has made it into the final report from the interim report. At the bottom, at number 34, page 42, we can see interchange should be arranged between staff of HPS and NHS boards and other activities considered to strengthen relationships and engender mutual respect and to help soften existing boundaries. This should include a wide range of activities, including joint learning sessions, joint training and web-based initiatives. Now, if we move across, we only see that recommendation was in the interim report, but then on the right-hand column we have these words: MHPN with the support of NHS boards and HPS. Can you explain to us, firstly, if you know, why this recommendation didn't make it into the final report and what is meant by the bodies in the final column?
Okay, perhaps in reverse order.
Okay.
The MHPN, I guess here is a managed health protection network. What ultimately came out of that was the Scottish Health Protection Network, an obligate network of stakeholders coming together who were mutually working with each other, including local authorities, to ensure that we had addressed all of the challenges presenting within health protection.
So managed health protection network, yeah. And this tells us that that organisation was working with the support of the NHS boards and HPS. So does that mean that because those systems were already in place, that recommendation didn't need to be taken forward to the final report. Is that how it worked?
Well, for many of these things that we were taking them beyond
Right.
that, because as I just suggested, that local authorities were now to become part and parcel of what we were trying to do to make sure that local delivery was addressed.
Thank you. Can we go to page 44, please? And highlight the entry under roles and responsibilities. Here we can see there is a need to improve communication between HPS and NHS boards. Interchange should be arranged between staff in both directions and other activities considered to strengthen relationships and engender mutual respect and to help soften existing boundaries. This should include a wide range of activities, including joint learning sessions, joint training and web-based initiatives. And we can see on the right-hand side, the assessment is that the managed health protection network is of course designed to help achieve a sense of integration between all parts of a service and should therefore be expected to serve a function of improving relationships and communication. However, our recommendation on interchange and other activities should stand. So this is how it appears in the table. Is the impression being created, Dr. McMenamin, that there was a difficulty perceived in terms of relationships between these bodies? And if so, how was that manifesting itself? And what was the proposed solution in order to engender better relationships?
I think that the principal thing here that we were trying to address was a levelling up.
Right.
To try and ensure that experience at a national level and at a local level was interchangeable, that we could then see and learn from each other. The Scottish Health Protection Network began to have that purpose by having that sharing of learning and experience across all of the health protection functions within Scotland.
And would you say that following on from this final report, things did begin to improve?
I think that it's certainly true that they were much improved as a consequence of the success of the Scottish Health Protection Network. That's not to say there are not continuing issues that we have had further effort to try and overcome.
All right, thank you very much. We can take that down now. Concentrating for a moment on the wider programme of health protection reform in Scotland, you tell us in your witness statement that the creation of Public Health Scotland was indeed part of a wider programme of public health reform. And you go on to note that HPS colleagues, yourself included, advocated throughout the reform period for recognition of the importance of actions to protect the public from outbreaks of communicable disease and incidents involving non-communicable environmental hazards to public health. Why was HPS required to advocate in that way?
I can offer you two potential answers to that. One which is a corporate one and perhaps one a personal one.
Please do.
So from a corporate perspective, I think that what was important here was that we were trying to ensure that there was health protection having its place at a table when the key objectives that were then listed were not immediately ones that jumped out saying health protection was at the centre of things. We had a further discussion on an ongoing basis about this, and that health protection, we were assured, was at the centre of everything that we were doing. On a personal note, that I can see that yes, that was important that we continued to advocate for clinical and scientific leadership for health protection being important, because we were mindful of the importance of incidents, outbreaks and, regrettably, pandemics.
All right, thank you. May we look briefly, please, at 102990? Because moving forwards, thank you very much. This is the 2015 review of public health in Scotland. It was, as we can see, strengthening the function and refocusing action for a healthier Scotland. It had as its basis Can you provide a summary of this document, please? We can see at the bottom that although it's headed 2015, it was actually produced finally in February of 2016.
Yes.
Tell us what this is about, please, Dr. McMenamin.
So here, and coming back to our central rationale for what we were trying to do, it was important that we were trying to put health inequalities at the centre of everything that we were doing. You've heard already testimony from Bamber and Marma about the stalling in life expectancy as one indicator of the health of the population. This was then occurring against this backdrop, where we were very aware of the need to try and come together to address those health inequalities and hopefully to then have an increase in the healthy life expectancy.
About the involvement of public health in terms of laboratories.
Yes, this is, and it's important, I think, here that there is an important distinction that I have to offer about what you may have already heard in testimony about for the Health Protection Agency,
yes,
for Public Health England, and then the UK Health Security Agency. In the laboratory services management was in a commissioning role only.
right.
So our opportunity then to have a great effort and discourse about that was certainly not something that was addressed in the main by this kind of document.
What role did HPS?
Right up until the end of the time period for which we are discussing, this pre-pandemic
yes.
period, our role was limited in the main to this commissioning role for the national laboratories that would be doing reference work. That's unlike the situation then where much of the routine work might be offered through either a combination of UXA laboratories in England and the NHS service laboratories.
Is it correct that the sponsors, the Scottish Government and the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, or COSLA, were engaged in developing an annual operation plan for PHS?
Yes, and the ongoing work which is developed following on from the beginning of the pandemic, and that we are currently involved in for some of the commissioning work, going beyond that into what is the needs assessment that we have for laboratory services across all of Scotland.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you now about the provision of expert advice to the Scottish and the UK government and the extent of HPS's involvement in scientific advisory groups such as NERVTAG and SAGE. What was the role of the Scottish Public Health Service in the NERVTAG advisory group? Was it a member to start off with?
So NERVTAG, and I'm sure that you've heard already quite a bit about this, is an organisation which has been set up, which has taken through a robust appointment process experts in individual areas. It just so happens that I was successful in application to that on a personal basis,
right,
rather than it being Public Health Scotland, which are represented at
yes.
that type of meeting.
Right, okay. And were there other representatives from other devolved nations also present when you were there?
At its inception, and it's changed over time, then it's certainly been important to have opportunity for other colleagues to be co-opted into that process. And Professor Peter Horby in the most recent past then has been instrumental in trying to ensure that dependent upon the setting that we're considering, that there's an appropriate scientific representation across the whole of the country.
Right. In terms of the subject matter that NERVTAG considered during your time there, do you have a view as to whether or not that was more limited than it might have been? And if it was, were there other aspects that you think, as an organisation, as an advisory group, they would have benefited from including in the matters that they considered and discussed?
Yeah, I'm very much struck by both the testimony that I've heard from witnesses here, but also from looking at the witness statements that have been provided both by Wendy Barclay and by Peter Horby.
Yes.
That they give a good account, I think, of that there is always this balance about. We have set questions that we're trying to address because the government of the day have key things that they would like us to address, but that the scientific curiosity of many of these individuals in the same room is extraordinary. That these experts are often bringing complex issues that they have noted would be important for the group to begin to consider, and there's opportunity through that network to then encourage one or other of the administrations or the Department of Health to then put that down as a significant item for discussion at our next meeting.
Yes, you may be aware of the evidence given earlier today by Sir Chris Whitty on this subject. He landed on an arbitrary percentage of 80-20, yes. But that, I think, accords with the evidence that you've just given, that there needs to be a two-way street, which is another phrase taken from Sir Mark Walport's evidence.
Absolutely. I don't quite know what the percentage is, and that as an epidemiologist, that you'll probably get an hour discourse from me about that, but yes, I agree.
All right, thank you very much. We know from your witness statement that you also sat on SAGE, representing HPS as it then was, PHS as it now is. And tell us about your time there, please, Dr. McMenamin, and whether you think that there are improvements that can be made in terms of the way that advisory group conducts itself.
My time as an observer in all of the proceedings, getting to as many of those as I possibly could, along with many colleagues, was an extraordinary examination, forensically at times, of the key challenges presented of the day. Those individuals who were coming, who were giving of their time freely, were truly incredible, and I have nothing but respect for everything that they were able to say and do. My role there was limited, perhaps, if there were key things that we were providing either as validation of observations that were occurring south of the border or in the other administrations, or for the first time being able to present interesting observations, particularly in the early days of the estimation of vaccine effectiveness, where we were able to say, using the EVE collaboration data that had been set up as a consequence of the hibernation projects set up after the swine flu pandemic. Right. Important observations there about early insight to what we might see in the population, and early light of a path potentially out of the lockdowns and social restrictions that we had in the population.
And whilst you were present at SAGE meetings, were you convinced that there were mechanisms in place to promote challenge and to ensure a range of views, as we've just discussed, is so important in these advisory groups? Yeah,
I think that all of the SAGE meetings were ably led by either of Sir Patrick Vallance or Chris Whitty, or others who might be deputising of the day. There were great opportunities for colleagues to be able to say without reservation what their own views were about particular challenges, and to challenge mindset about any key things that were being discussed.
Thank you. A different topic now. I'd like to ask you about HPS's status as a Category 2 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. What is your view of it being assessed as a Category 2 responder? Do you think there is merit in its categorisation being raised to a Category 1 responder, or do you foresee difficulties if that were to happen?
And if I can present two things there,
Yes,
both a corporate thing and a personal thing. From a corporate perspective, I can see that it is really important that we have a Category 1 response labelling, because we are at the heart of the assessment of risk. We are important in all of that. On a personal basis, I can't understand why our organisation should not be designated as a Category 1 on the basis of the guidance and response function that we have in supporting major incidents and pandemics.
Becoming a Category 1 responder carries with it additional responsibilities and duties. Do you consider, Dr McMenamin, that Public Health Scotland is able to provide those, and is the right organisation dealing with public health to be able to carry out those additional duties and responsibilities?
Absolutely, with one caveat, and that is obviously resource.
Funding, yeah. All right, thank you. Finally, I'd like to take you through a series of scenario testing exercises and to ask your expert opinion on what you think worked well and what might be capable of being improved. There are some names here that the inquiry has not yet heard about because they are Scottish specific. One back in April of 2009, an exercise called Craw. What was that all about, Dr McMenamin?
So, as you might imagine, it would be something to do with a crow or the like. So, of course, the avian influenza and influenza immediately spring to mind. And, of course, that's exactly what it was about.
All right. You note in your statement that the plans for this exercise were, in fact, overtaken by the swine flu pandemic. And although it was well planned, the tabletop exercise itself did not take place. Was it rescheduled?
I beg your pardon?
Was it rescheduled?
Which, sorry?
Called Craw.
Yeah, I think that it was not rescheduled, particularly because we suddenly had a natural event that was presenting not too long afterwards with the swine influenza pandemic. So my understanding, at least of my own recollection or of others of the time, was that we had a natural challenge that immediately followed.
Do you know whether any of the preparations for the exercise were able to be drawn upon when swine flu hit?
Certainly, much of the constant evolution of thinking that we had in any of our preparedness was to address many aspects of what were to be covered by that kind of exercise. In particular, for the avian influenza database that we had, that ultimately became what you will, I'm sure, hear more about in response to Module 2 with the first few 100s approach that we had for gathering clear, concise information about the first cases of any new infection.
Also known as FF100, isn't it? The next exercise on my list is Castle Rock in September of 2010. I'm not going to ask you about the details of that because it simulated a chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear incident, so far from the topic of this inquiry. But I would like to ask you about the fact that this was an exercise led by both the UK and Scottish governments. Do you have a view as to how well a joint operation such as that, and we're going to come in a moment to talk about exercise Cygnus, but how something created by governments in two separate nations are capable of providing benefit to both of those nations. Is that something that you would promote? Or do you think that the Scottish-only exercises, designed and focused as they were on Scotland, are better in the long run?
Well, I think the truth of that is that the answer is you need both.
Yeah.
We need to have that local exercise capability to see what we can focus on. What sometimes is forgotten is every